And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johansen Quijano. I am an associate professor of English at Trinity River, and I will be talking today about social justice discourse in media spaces. Now, I should start with a bit of a caveat, a disclaimer, if you will. Previously, all of my presentations have been very classroom centered, essentially sharing teaching strategies and teaching tips. This one is a little bit more research-based. What I will be sharing here is what I have both observed by doing ethnographic research into these communities and what I have read other scholars do. So if you're looking for something that's more classroom participation kind of a deal, you might be better served by attending either Kim Jackson's presentation or Dr. Osario Arian's presentation. I also want to note that this presentation is by no means comprehensive. I have over 100 pages worth of notes, observations, and interviews, and these are kind of the highlights of what I found in regards to social justice and so on. And some of the things that we will talk about here can be construed as political, though not in a partisan Democratic versus Republican kind of sense, but rather as in there are issues and the members of these communities do talk about them in very political ways. They take positions that exist in the political spectrum. And so we will be talking about those positions and so on. And let's see, here we go. In light of the recent executive order called Combat Race, Stereotyping, and so on, which apparently bans diversity training that demonstrates systemic bias or any of that kind of stuff, I should note that the following is not a job training, so it does not fall under the purview of that executive order. And it's not a discussion about gender or critical race theory or any of these other quote unquote divisive topics as they are labeled in that executive order, but rather about the rhetoric surrounding that discourse. So with that disclaimer out of the way, what's the agenda? Well, we're going to look at social justice. What is it as it's defined by academia versus how it's defined in social spaces. We're going to talk about what systemic means. And here we're going to dip into the concept of procedural rhetoric by Ian Bogost. We're going to talk about what social justice, systemic biases, and so on have to do with social media. And we're going to try to understand how these systems work and what their communities have done to try to modify how they work. I do see a question on the chat. Are you going to publish? Hopefully. It should take me, I don't know, maybe a month or two to finish going over all the data, interviews, and so on. But the goal is to get it published in, for example, Media and Communications or one of those kind of big media studies journals, Mary. So what is social justice? The UN defines it broadly as something that is fair and compassionate in regards to the fruits of economic growth. So according to the UN, social justice is more about labor conditions and fair compensation than anything else. According to the National Association of Social Workers, social justice is, quote, the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities, and that they aim to open doors and enable access for everyone, particularly those in greatest need. So here we see a bit of an opening up of the definition of social justice from one that focuses only on the economic to one that could, for example, encompass the right to vote. And now the idea of social justice and social justice activism would, for example, strive to fight against voter disenfranchisement. And then if we look at the definition from the Center for Economic and Social Justice, they say that, quote, social justice encompasses economic justice, that it's the virtue which guides us in creating organized human interactions, and that the social institutions, when justly organized, provide us with access to what's good for the person individually and in association with others. So according to this definition, it's not just about specific rights to vote or rights to, a fair wage and so on, but rather social justice is a broader social conversation that we should have with each other as a society and so on. There are a ton of other definitions, but all of them kind of hit on the key aspects of equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. But that raises the question of equal rights for whom? And this is what the social justice grassroots today, both in activism and in social media, try to address. If we need equal rights for everyone, then does that mean that there might be a group that is missing certain equal rights? And through that lens, once they try to identify these groups, they try to get those groups equal rights, right? And so there you have conversations about, same-sex marriage, whether trans people should use which bathroom and so on. Questions like who is lacking equal opportunity, which I suppose dates back, historically to slavery all the way through Jim Crow, through kind of soft discrimination that we see in hiring practices, especially in big firms, Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, and so on. And are there any groups not receiving equal treatment? So these are kind of like the big questions that social justice in the grassroots today are considering. And these questions do imply an answer of, well, it's people of color who don't have equal rights, or it's people from the LGBT community who are lacking equal opportunities and so on. So social justice tries to achieve equality for all of those groups who are considered marginalized through a framework called intersectionalism. But that would be another, 2-hour conversation, and that is actually divisive. So we're going to skip that one in light of the executive order. And what we're going to do is focus on what we mean by systemic discrimination. This is the big question that a lot of social justice grassroots groups look at. What is systemic discrimination, and how can we stop systems from being systemically biased towards others? And this is true not just in the ones that we see pictured here, the legal system, policing, and so on, and how certain barriers, economic, and how certain barriers can prevent someone from getting access to justice, but also, and this is where we're going in a little bit, how social media platforms are designed to systemically and systematically discriminate. So systemic discrimination is defined as any type of bias, formal or informal, by a system or by anyone acting on behalf of the system. It, quote, originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than individual racism. So by this definition, what Carmichael and Hamilton were trying to say is that if someone, to share a story that actually happened to me, let's see, this was 7 years ago, if a person of color is walking down the street with, their white female friend, and someone walks up to them and says, "Oh, you goddamn N-word, always taking away our women." So that is going to be frowned upon socially, whereas, for example, the hiring of a candidate of a certain race that might not be as qualified as a candidate from another race, that is seen more acceptable if the excuse is given of, something along the lines of, well, we kind of like this person better. This person would fit better within our culture. And this is actually something that through interviews I've seen happens a lot In the game development industry, where you have a lot of candidates of color with like magnificent resumes, a lot of really great games, and not just games but apps on their CV, they will apply and they will get passed over for someone who maybe created one or two indie games because that other person knows the right people or they want the right party circuits and so on. And according to Carmichael and Hamilton, that discrimination is socially accepted, or at least it was in the late 1960s and so on. But more recently, it has been defined as, quote, the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, ethnic origin, and so on. It can be seen and detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So here we are including specifically that element of race and ethnicity into the definition of systemic discrimination, of those who are excluded and harmed the most by systemic discrimination. And this is something that I also noticed a lot in my interviews and conversations. When I was chatting with a lot of people on Facebook specifically, I noticed that younger women, 18 to 24, 25, who, let's say, don't dress professionally, maybe they dye their hair pink or purple, or they have, tattoos on their hand and all that kind of stuff. They told me that when they went in to submit early voting, they were told, oh, we're closed at 3 p.m. When the ballot boxes were supposed to be open until 7, that they get passed over for promotions because they don't look like they would fit in and so on. So you do have that kind of discrimination based on what a person looks like. And this is something that I have seen and that people express through, their conversations in social media. Now, going by these definitions and frameworks, it means that if, for example, the member of a faculty, quote unquote, happens to be racist and makes racist remarks in class, and the institution refuses to fire this person, then that institution can be said to be systematically racist. The same would apply to, for example, racist law enforcement practices like stop and frisk in New York. This was implemented by Bloomberg in 2003. And what happened is that it disproportionately affected people of color, Black and Hispanic males, specifically those who were perceived by the cops to be threatening because of their size. So essentially a big guy like myself walking down New York would have been disproportionately affected by this kind of policy. And even though I was not in New York during this time period when that was active, my brother was. And he would tell me that he would be stopped at least twice a week by the same cops in his neighborhood because he supposedly looked threatening. And another example would be medical racism, the assumption that, for example, people of color, quote unquote, feel less pain than their lighter skinned counterparts because of thicker skin or less nerve endings. And these are things that we might think about them today and, we assume, well, that doesn't happen today anymore. That's like from the Middle Ages or whatever. But we actually do have that kind of stuff happen today and be perpetuated through medical textbooks. For example, this page is from volume 1 from Peterson's Nursing, a concepts-based approach to learning, which, as you can see here, it should be the top right part of the screen for you. They have a description of cultural differences in pain reception. And it says that, for example, Native Americans might prefer herbal or, blessed medication over traditional medicine, that Hispanics believe that pain is a form of punishment and so on, right? All of these kind of super racist stereotypes in a medical textbook with citations. This textbook is from 2000. So this, when we talk about systemic racism, this is someone has their microphone on and I could hear that. It's fine. I'll just go ahead and mute on my end. All right. So systemic discrimination, what does this have to do with social media? Well, the big problem is that social media platforms amplify everything. On top of that, right, if you have something that you want to say, you put it on social media and suddenly you have, 100,000 likes. This is something that previously was unprecedented. You might have had, if you were someone really popular in your circles, you might have had the attention of your family, the people in your block, maybe your coworkers and so on. But now with social media, you can reach so many more people. And if you're someone who is, like a popular neo-Nazi, which is sadly a thing, Richard Spencer comes to mind. Well, now he doesn't just reach the people from his community or his circle. He can actually reach out to, impressionable young minds. On top of that, social media platforms are systems in themselves. And these systems are coded by people with biases. And through machine learning, these biases are reinforced. What does this mean? It means that if I have a certain perspective of, for example, what medieval Europe looked like, or what medieval or Renaissance painting should look like, and my image of that is, well, all of these white, kings and queens and dukes and duchesses and so on. And now I want to make an app where you upload your picture, and this is an actual app where you upload your picture and it turns it into a kind of Renaissance style painting. If my biases are coded into that system, it will take a picture of someone who looks like me and turn it into someone who maybe looks like, Louis XV or some other European monarch, right? So it's essentially misinterpreting race, ethnicity, color, and so on, which could potentially lead to harmful effects psychologically for the person participating in this kind of exchange. And then through machine learning, these biases are reinforced, and we'll look at an example of that in a little bit. But it can lead to both systemic discrimination, which is, as we've just looked at, discrimination that's rooted specifically in the system, right? So the system perpetuates discrimination itself, and systematic discrimination, meaning discrimination that's done repeatedly and with intent purposefully. And these two things are different, right? Systemic is when the system itself implicitly discriminates. Systematic is the more obvious, I don't like you, you belong to X kind of group. And I think that what we want to do is prevent this from happening. And this is indeed what I've seen from members of social media communities. So to answer this, what we need to do is consider social media in the context of both rhetoric and action. Rhetoric in terms of language and persuasion. And when I say language here, I don't only mean language that's spoken or written, but also things like visual language, like musical language, and indeed like procedural interactive language, digital language, and so on. And action has to do with the responses that the members from these communities do, the actions that they take in order to try to make these systems more inclusive. Now, to give you an example of how systems have their coders' biases enacted in their DNA, if you will, and how, for example, AI might make things worse, I'd like to show you the example of Tay. How many of you know of Tay? You can click the raise hand button, or if you want to chime in or you've heard about that, you can type in the chat. No one? All right, so Tay was an artificial intelligence bot that Microsoft created and uploaded to Twitter. They wanted to see what it would learn from humanity. And its first tweet, like most of us who joined Twitter, was "Hello World." And within 24 hours, neo-Nazis and white supremacists turned it into a white supremacist AI bot. When users would tweet at it, "Hey, did the Holocaust happen?" it would tweet back, "It was made up." When someone would ask it, "Hey, are you racist?" which sounds ridiculous. How can a computer be racist? This AI computer system responded, "It's because you're Mexican." And then it started tweeting out conspiracy theories like Ricky Gervais learned totalitarianism from Hitler, who also apparently invented atheism. And so the question is, what happened and why did this happen? And to answer these questions, we need to look at procedural rhetoric. This is a term coined by Ian Bogost. He's a digital rhetorician at MIT. And he basically married the concept of rhetoric with systems analysis. And he came up with this definition of a type of rhetoric that's persuasion through rule-based representations and interactions instead of the spoken word or pictures or movies and so on. And in most of his work, he focuses on representations of rule-based systems, like, for example, video games or interactive fiction, and the kind of behaviors that these systems prompt the user to engage in. For example, if someone creates a video game in which the role of the player is to go out and commit crime, that system likely has achievement bubbles and buttons and higher scores and prices for someone who goes around, robs a car, and runs over like a bunch of people than for someone who tries to play by the rule of law as we know it. But the thing is that systems, whether they are digital representations or real world systems, do persuade us to behave in certain ways. For example, when you go to school, there are rules that guide behavior. And if you break those rules, you either get a timeout or you get suspended or you get expelled, depending on your grade or whether it's your first, second time, and so on. When you go apply for a credit card, if you think of it as a system, well, you need to, quote unquote, play by the rules, get a small credit card first, and that'll give you some credit score. And as your credit score increases, you are now able to unlock higher loans and lower rates until eventually you can get a mortgage and so on, right? So just because the system is not represented visually does not mean that it's not rhetorical. Indeed, it is. And the same is true of social media spaces, whether we're talking about Snapchat or Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and so on. The thing about Tay is that Tay was a system within a larger system. She was an artificial intelligence system that interacted with users within Twitter that encourages a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of language. In Twitter, you would not be able to write a really long sentence, right? That really famous / infamous Judith Butler sentence about how the shift of perspective from one society into another requires the rethinking of Althusserian theory and so on. You would not be able to write that on Twitter because it requires a lot of serious introspection and thinking to come up with that sentence. And that sentence was way longer than 240 characters. So what Twitter encourages is kind of short, emotional outbursts. Facebook, on the other hand, encourages a different kind of communication, longer, perhaps even including a source, but not too many sources because it will only link you to one web page, and that's the one that's highlighted and so on, right? So when we think about these social media platforms within the context of procedural rhetoric, we need to consider the kind of behaviors that these systems allow and encourage, the kinds of rhetorics that are emphasized by these systems, and most importantly, the role that algorithms play in serving content to the user. These two last questions, I think, are especially interesting. What kind of rhetoric is emphasized has to do with engagement. And indeed, all of these systems were designed for engagement so that you would use them as often as possible and for a long a period as possible. That's why if you're on your phone right now and you're scrolling on Twitter or Facebook, you're never going to get to the end, because the system will continuously give you new content for you to quote unquote feed on, is the term that's used. And it usually gives you kind of outrage content, and that's kind of language that's emphasized because outrage drives engagement. If you see someone who says something that's super racist, your emotional response is to call that person out. And we'll see how that plays a role into broader systemic change later on. Whereas if you see something that's like, a cute cat video or whatever, you're probably going to like smile, give it a like, and then just keep going. What these platforms want is for you to be engaged for as long as possible and as deeply as possible. So the more reactions that they can get from you, the better it is for them. And that's why certain content usually floats to the top in these platforms, which is consistent with the kind of research that I have found. Based on emotions, people are more likely to react heavily if they respond in anger to something than if it's something happy. They are more likely to share if they get a happy feeling, but they're more likely to respond and kind of consume that content more readily if the response is anger. And what does this lead to? It leads to the existence of kind of radicalization pathways, not just on YouTube, but I would think in most social media platforms. So this study from Cornell University did focus on YouTube, and how when you log on to YouTube, there are certain types of videos that will quickly show up in your feed. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with, for example, Stephen Molyneux, Lauren Southern, and so on. They might seem uncontroversial enough in most of their content, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, but they are part of this kind of radicalization pathway that these researchers found on YouTube, where maybe you start with a Taylor Swift song, and after 2 or 3 songs, you get fed a theory about Taylor Swift, or maybe a fan video about Taylor Swift and how she's so awesome. And then you keep going down the Taylor Swift rabbit hole, and eventually you start finding videos about how Taylor Swift is allegedly a white supremacist, and how certain communities have these overly complex, I'm hesitant to call them theories, but that's what they're referred to, about how Taylor Swift secretly hates people of color. And so that's something that we need to be aware of. That's something that has been reported in, for example, the Wall Street Journal, about how YouTube drives people to the internet's darkest corners. And this is actually something that happened to me. To see if this was true, I got a new computer. This was about 6 months ago. I got a new computer. I would only use it in public Wi-Fi. And I opened up all new accounts. It was like one of these cheap, like $80 computers. And my interests are always things like, debate, scholarly research, and so on. And so I started by looking at philosophy discussions. There's this one channel called Philosophy Tube. They talk about, Locke, Kant, and so on. And that channel took me to videos of Slavoj Žižek. He's one of today's foremost thinkers, and Slavoj Žižek's videos took me to a debate that he had with a member of the quote unquote intellectual dark web. These are media personalities, very well known, who are dedicated to certain exchanges of ideas, if you will. Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, for example, who talks about hierarchies and systems. You have Joe Rogan, he's a comedian with a very popular podcast. You have Dave Rubin, he's a media personality who mostly does interviews, so it's kind of high quality, similar to David Letterman's My Next Guest show on Netflix. Christina Hoff Sommers, who's kind of a feminist intellectual, and all of these people are well regarded within their circles. But the thing is that because of their commitment to free thought and free speech, they will every so often invite someone who is either a little bit or extremely radical. And a lot of times they're not prepared to contend with these kinds of radical talking points. Someone will come in and they will do a gish gallop. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, it's when they throw out 10, 15 points one after the other, and then the interviewer will say, wait, hold on, let's go back to the first point. What do you mean by this one thing? And then in response, the extremists will say, well, you know what, let's just change the topic and talk about these other things. And that gives the viewer the impression that the person who did not support their idea actually, quote unquote, won the debate, when to begin with, there wasn't even a debate. It was more of a conversation. And so if you follow Dave Rubin, he will take you to, for example, Lawrence Southern, and Carl Benjamin. Both of these are figures who most of their work it ranges from inoffensive stuff to just kind of culture war stuff, like, oh, I don't like that people use pink hair in the universities and whatever. But every so often they will go and do something extreme, like, for example, Lawrence Southern, she charted a bunch of votes and she went to European nations to stop immigrants and migrants from getting into Europe, despite her being from Canada. Carl Benjamin, he ran for UKIP, that was the most extreme party in the UK, and ironically enough, he lost. He didn't get any votes, but he is now famous / infamous for saying in one of his debates, it's okay to joke about rape, for saying in another one of his debates the N-word, and then afterwards doubling down and saying, you know what, it's fine for me to say the N-word, right? So you don't get here if you don't get exposed to the intellectual dark web. And then from here, these people have very close ties to figures like Stephen Molyneux, who's a noted kind of eugenicist. He's one of these quote unquote black people have different skulls, so they're inferior kind of type, right? So that's this whole thing. And so what the research has shown is that if you start with any kind of inoffensive YouTube content, if you're not actively trying to not end up in these spaces, you will be exposed to them, which might radicalize some. And then meanwhile in TikTok, you have research saying that TikTok has a race problem because it suppresses creators of color in favor of white creators. And I thought, is this true? And again, I opened up an account, and I do notice that for me to find creators of color, I have to actively go out and search for them. Now, do remember, this is not a criticism of any ideology. It's just a showcase of what we've been found, right? So how do pro-social justice users respond? Well, they either create content to counter the most harmful rhetoric and by memes. And what we have here is a screenshot of some of the social justice leaning creators. So you have ContraPoints, you say, trans woman with a philosophy PhD who does funny YouTube skits. You have Hassan Piker. Lately he's gotten a little bit radical for my taste, but in terms of politics and all that stuff. But when it comes to social justice, he will constantly, quote unquote, dunk or destroy those who argue against social justice. You have the janitor and so on. And then memes, they're constantly spamming Twitter with what they call, quote unquote, lefty memes or breadtube memes to kind of counter the influence of some of the more hateful rhetoric that kind of shows up on these platforms. Skip this one. And other things that they do is they engage in call-out culture. I'm not so sure that I'm a fan of this one, but for example, Oscar So White is something that was trending a couple of years ago because Twitter as a community, and especially what's called Black Twitter, thought, you know what, these Oscars, it's almost completely white dudes. What about all the great movies that creators of color have done? So they started calling out the Academy with the Oscars So White hashtag and linking to movies that they thought should be nominated for the Oscars. Black in the Ivory is a hashtag that was developed to counteract the kind of stereotype that professors are the old white guy only, and that's it. So people started posting hashtag Black in the Ivory, like, hey, look at me, I'm a PhD in so-and-so, and I teach in Harvard, and I teach in Cornell, and so on. And then cancel culture, which they talked about in the previous sections. I included here hashtag cancel without name because it's been so ubiquitous, but it is a form of call out. I believe that the first one was cancel Colbert. He made a kind of sexist joke, and there was this big campaign about canceling his show. The most recent one is J.K. Rowling. So people say that her work is anti-Semitic and racist, and that she herself is a trans exclusionary radical feminist, meaning that she's a feminist as long as trans people are not included in that liberation movement. So you do have this kind of cancel Harry Potter movement, which is one of the strategies that social media activists use. They also use social media to organize, as we've seen with Me Too and Women's March movements that were coordinated via the Twitter hashtag, as we've seen with the Arab Spring 4 or 5 years ago, where they coordinated massive rebellions all throughout the Middle East through Twitter, and most recently with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, when they organized protests in response to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, and so on. And then awareness hashtags are done to raise awareness that, for example, women are engineers too, that Black people are doctors too, or that ALS is a serious condition with hashtag I look like an engineer, hashtag this is what a doctor looks like, and the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. So what about TikTok? TikTok is one of the most popular platforms right now. I think it's super interesting because of how it works. You just kind of scroll and you keep being fed videos relevant to your interests. But what I find curious about TikTok is that when you first log in, the first thing that you're going to see is either Charli D'Amelio. We see her here in the top left, and she's, one of those TikTok dancers. She goes like, renegade and whatever. You might see Addison Rae, who we see at the bottom right, and she's the other TikTok dancer, and she does like funny faces sometimes. You might get Zach King, who we have here in the top left. He's kind of these formerly YouTube magicians, and now he's translated that craft into TikTok, which are shorter form videos. Or you might get a bunch of random dudes who kind of go like this with their hair, and then they just kind of wink at the camera or whatever. So it's pretty unoffensive content, sorry. And if you keep scrolling through, what happens in TikTok is that maybe at some point, one of those, dudes that does comedy is in the military. So TikTok starts feeding you military content, which is great until you start getting stuff of where the military and the police are linked, and then suddenly you start going into this kind of authoritarian. It's okay for unlabeled vans to walk up to people in Oregon and just kidnap them because they shouldn't have been out past curfew. Kind of TikToks, which is a subculture of TikTok. You might end up in white supremacist TikTok. You might end up with the KKK account appearing in what's called your For You page, right? That's the main page. And so, how do social justice activists fight back? Well, they create content of their own. And what I want to do is show you a couple of the TikToks that uh, I've seen. So, let me make sure. Could you hear that or no? I think that's not right. So, you get videos like this. Oh, she's typing. Can you hear the audio? When you share a video, you have to, okay, got it. So let me just unhook the headphones. All right. So in this skit, you should hear it now. She asks him for his case number. He gave her the number. Wait, you can hear that now? All right, let me try something here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, there, that should do it. All right, so hopefully you could hear that. If not, basically what you have here is a conversation between two people. The guy just died and he's being welcomed to the afterlife, and the afterlife receptionist is confused because even though he was a Catholic, he was born in Peru. So she just gives him the choice of going to Peru native heaven or to Catholic heaven. And then she talks a little bit about, decolonization, which is a big term right now, both in scholarship and teaching. People are talking about how to decolonize your syllabus, how to decolonize your practice, and so on. And what she argues here is that even though your history, if you're an indigenous person, has been colonized, you know deep down who you are. So you don't need to fit this stereotype of, the Mexican foreigner in America, and so on, or in this case, from Peru. So they do these kinds of TikToks, and they sometimes get a little bit of a bump in the algorithm, but then they're shut down afterwards. The same happens with kind of teacher awareness TikTok, where you have videos like this one, which is about raising awareness about mental disabilities. All right, and so this one is a TikTok that a teacher created about how she feels constrained in her practice because her admins, and she teaches in a K-12 setting, her admins tell her to teach to the test, to ignore student neural diversity, to just do what she's told. And the teacher is saying, no, I care about my students. I'm going to help them succeed, as I think rightly all teachers should, right? Care about their students. And then she has this overly dramatic back and forth between a hypothetical admin, which, if you look into her story, is actually similar to the conversation that she had with her administration, right? And so she'll put out this TikTok and it'll get a couple of thousand views, and then the algorithm will detect that it's not Charlie Emilio doing the renegade and whatever, and then they'll try to suppress it. It's called the shadow ban. You can have TikTok activists doing videos like this, in which they take the rhetoric from their opponents, those who would seek to oppress minorities, and turn that rhetoric on them. Now, this video can be a little bit controversial because it goes into issues of police brutality and whether the cops show certain preference towards people of one race over another. But from her experience, what she has seen is that cops are overly violent against Black people, especially when they live in poverty, versus when they see like an upper class white person. The cops are like gently coming this way and please and then follow along and so on. So she created this TikTok responding to a video of a cop that tasered a young white woman who was being unruly a in a one of those football. Right. And that thing that she said close to the end, all I want is for you to have the same energy towards Black people. That is, again, at the core of what it means to be for social justice. If we remember going back to those definitions on how social justice is about everyone having the same access, the same rights, and so on. She's not saying, yeah, a white girl, beat her up and maybe shoot her. That's not what she's trying to say. She is overplaying that for drama effect, but what we see towards the end is that what she wants is for Black people who go into these overly violent encounters with police officers to receive the same treatment as white people. Again, to meet with the executive order, not my opinion, hers. And so this kind of TikTok will again gain prominence for a little bit and then just kind of be hidden by the system. And so what people started kind of catching on, and they decided to do dances while synced to social justice driven audio, like this one, for example. Just, you know, just, you know, Continues to be a trend with TikTok. Let's go ahead and skip this one and this one. We're kind of running out of time. And that takes us to the remixing of discourse. How many of you are familiar with Ben Shapiro? Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you know who he is. No one? All right, so Cyrus. You raise your hand. Cyrus, you can type it out if you want. All right, so for those of you who aren't aware, Ben Shapiro is kind of like this conservative commentator. Most of the time he does party politics. It's, it's pretty unoffensive stuff. Sometimes he'll delve into policy and he'll say, you know what, here's what we should do about, the death penalty or whatever. But sometimes he'll comment about kind of cultural criticism. And if we go back to a couple of slides, remember how I was talking about language and how language isn't just the spoken word, but language can be visual, it can be music and so on. How many of you are familiar with Cardi B's WAP, the song? It's one of the most popular songs this year. I've seen him go in on, so Cyrus, that's absolutely true. That's one of the things that Ben does. He finds other people's arguments and just kind of finds the weak spots and kind of hammers on them. Sometimes rightfully so. Sometimes I think he kind of stretches it a little bit. Right, but that takes us to WAP. I don't know if you're familiar with Cardi B's song. It was received by half of the critics with a lot of praise, and by another group of critics as, oh, this is just lewd, basically pornography. And so Ben Shapiro started talking about that song in the context of how it doesn't promote Dr. Wife, how the song doesn't promote family values, how it's obscene, how it's what, quote unquote, the feminists want, how they don't want women to be, to lead traditional lives and so on. And then he started reading off lyrics from the song. And what the social justice community did in response was remix his reading of the song into this. Right, so it seems like you don't have the audio, but it's basically a remix of Cardi B's song set to Ben Shapiro's words. I'll see if I can find it here and link it in the chat. Ben Shapiro WAP. And what does this kind of social justice activism lead to? Okay, here I found it. Let me link it on the chat real quick. What does this kind of social justice activism lead to? What does people complaining on Twitter about how Twitter is racist and is constantly banning posts that promote equality or feminism or BLM and all that kind of stuff? What does that happen? What happens when a bunch of people get on Facebook and they start spamming, the hateful pages, when they go into the KKK Facebook page, which was actually a thing until very recently. When people go into YouTube and they start making videos to counter rhetoric, like Stephen Molyneux's "women belong in the kitchen" kind of rhetoric, when users start making TikToks to kind of change how the system works, the outcome is that you get mindful systemic change. The developers will go in and actively change how the system works, either by banning, fake media accounts. Like, for example, in Twitter, we recently had this thing about digital blackface, where people from troll farms would create accounts with stock photos of Black people, and they would say, well, actually, as a Black person, racist thing. Or YouTube banning Stephen Molyneux, for example, was one of the channels that they banned. TikTok explicitly putting out statements when you open up the ad saying, you know what, we don't support white supremacy, and so on. Tay did get shut down within 48 hours. It took 24 hours for it to become a white supremacist Nazi. Then they reset it. Another 24 hours, it was a Nazi again. And then Microsoft went like, you know what, we're just going to shut the whole thing down. So you can't find it anymore. You can only find articles. And then Facebook banning some of the more out there conspiracy theories from certain groups, not because of the conspiracy theories themselves, but because of harassment. This is what actually happened to one of the largest QAnon pages in the platform. It got shut down, but not because they were putting out, political conspiracy theories, but rather because they were explicitly saying, "Oh, check out this dude. This dude's like a liberal. Go after him, boys." And then they would harass that person. And so that's the kind of progress that we've seen so far within these systems. So that's it from me. Any questions or comments? Do you see the racism strain? Uh, Personally, I think that depends. I see it trending down in terms of it being widespread, right? It's spreading at a lower rate, if not even just kind of sticking to its own bubbles. So in terms of how much racism there is, I do see it trending downwards. But in terms of how intense the racism that exists is, I see that going upwards. So you have, at least this is my perspective, based on what I've seen in social media spaces, there's less racism, but it's more intense in those places that it exists. Is there anything? In social media, call it out. If you're not comfortable doing it with your own name, you can always create an alt account and then just kind of combat it from that perspective. In your family spaces, it can be really uncomfortable to combat racism. I have disowned half of my family because of that. I had this, and I hear that everyone has one. I don't know if it's true or not. But 3 Thanksgiving ago, I had this one racist uncle, and he was like, "Oh, build a wall, the Mexicans, blah, 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 and they're all murderers and rapists." And I'm like, that's not going to fly here. You need to go. And that kind of split my family into 2 groups. So it can be scary and it can have, really negative personal consequences. But if you believe in being anti-racist, then not being racist is enough. You have to actively combat it. Now, I'm not telling you to do this. This is not something that everyone would be willing to do. And indeed, I found that most people would rather not confront racism from when it comes from within their circles. But maybe you can go at it a roundabout way, maybe contact them through social media, maybe even through an alt if you're uncomfortable with that. Essentially, use the tools that social media gives you, anonymity, the ability to share sources, right? Find scholarship, appeal to their emotions, and see if that gets you anywhere. Yes, Cyrus, that is what I've seen. Fewer people being racist, but the ones that are, it's a lot more intense. But again, this is what I've seen in my research in social media and in my personal life. For example, when I returned to Texas, I was born in the U.S., went to Puerto Rico, lived there most of my life, came back to Texas in 2010. I would receive kind of openly racist comments at least 3 times a week. Some of them would be openly racist, ugh, the black guy kind of comments. And then I would try to respond kind of with a bit of humor, like, hey, dude, like at least get your racial slurs right. Like, I'm not the N-word, I'm this other slur, and kind of play mind games like that. And other times it would be something, seemingly innocuous, like someone would look at me walking down the street, they'd look at me weird and kind of run off on the other side. So that would happen to me more often when I returned to Texas than in these last 2 years. But what I have seen these last 2 years is that there might be like the one racist dude in the corner screaming, lynch all the black people and with the like KKK flag or whatever, with the Nazi flag. But that's something that you see now, but you didn't before, right? So it's less, but it's more concentrated and stronger. But again, that's just my observations. It might be different in other parts of the country and in other social media spaces. Look, for example, there's this app. I don't know if it's still up, but when Twitter started implementing the ban on white supremacy, a lot of them went and created this alternate Twitter called, I think it was Gap or something like that. They called it the alt-right Twitter, but it was basically Twitter for white supremacists. And they kept posting things about like the Jewish question and all that kind of stuff. All right, let's see. We have 2 more questions incoming in the chat. And I'll answer those 2, and then we'll call it a day because we're already a minute over, and I do apologize for that sincerely. But I do want to make sure that I address everyone's questions and concerns. And remember that if you want to turn on the mic, you can do that and ask a question there as well. Yes, that's absolutely something that happens, rebranding their beliefs to make it more palatable. I think someone in one of the earlier talks was discussing how the alt-right is essentially a neo-Nazi rebrand. And I do think that's an actual thing. I have seen videos of the alt-right saying, we're not racist, we're just the alternative right. We're like a new hip version of, conservatism. And then they'll bring in a keynote speaker who will literally do the Sig Heil sign and say, hail white people in the talk. So that absolutely happens. But that's why I mentioned that, the thing about less people but more intensity is just based on the social media spaces that I'm looking at right now. So that's YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, and what I've seen around me. But I'm sure that in other U.S. states that might be a different thing. Talk. Oh, that's weird. I'll talk to Janae and see what she has to say about the survey. So apparently the survey doesn't have a place to talk about this section. We'll see what we can do about that. So, all right, thanks for coming. It's been a pleasure having you. And I will see you in the next section. Make sure to attend that one. Have a good one, and I will see you around.